The revolutions that are going on in the Arab world are different in one respect, and that is they combine two big ideological forces. One is the desire for greater freedom, democracy, holding government accountable. But they also have a large Islamist feature because the regimes that were in power not only suppressed individual freedom, they also suppressed a large part of the Islamic movement. And so these two movements, the democratic movement and the Islamist movement, are both coming up together. That makes these revolutions distinct. At the same time, they have many features of revolutions that are familiar from history. They have an initial popular phase that's mainly mobilization in the street. They have an effort by moderates to limit the revolution and to preserve some of the old regime. And I think they will soon have the struggle between those seeking more major, radical changes and those who are still kind of hanging on to what we saw from the past. So that in Egypt in particular, the confrontation between the Muslim Brotherhood and the military is really going to pit those who want a new Egypt against those in the military who are trying to keep some of the older Egypt in place. Well, Europeans need to remember that these revolutions are all about the effort by Arab people to take control of their lives and take control of their own governments. So Europeans should not view this as a place where they can have great influence. Indeed, if European governments try to have too much of an influence on Arab governments, they may be seen as in the way or creating problems rather than building alliances or giving support. I do think that European governments should generally be pleased because European values, that is, a desire for democracy, for government accountability, for personal freedom, is very important to these revolutions. At the same time, Europeans need to realize that these countries will not simply follow a copy of the European path. They have to find their own way forward within their own culture, but at the same time, they want to work together with Europe, just as much as Europe wants to have friends on its southern border. So I think we need Europeans to be supportive, but not to expect that they can set the path that will be followed by the countries in the Arab world. I think the United States and Europe have a responsibility to be supportive of the efforts of the peoples of the Arab world to claim their destiny. That support sometimes will take the form of sanctions against dictators. It will sometimes take the form of direct military support for people fighting for their freedom, as was the case in Libya, and may end up at some point being the case in Syria. But again, it's important to have humility. The United States and Europe can only support whatever the people of the region do. We've seen in Syria that we don't have much ability to dramatically change the flow of events. In a sense, the United States and Europe will do well to be handmaidens of history in these cases, because the history is being made by the people of the region. One thing you can probably expect is even more immigrants from North Africa coming to Europe. The revolutions will not be easy or simple. There will be waves of violence and disorder, and it's likely to spur some waves of migration from the Arab world to those European cities. Now, that is, of course, an issue because Europe's immigration policies are not always friendly, but it's also an opportunity to build bridges and understanding. It would be great if the communities of migrants in Europe fully shared in European societies and could talk about the freedom that European values offer. One of my friends in the United States says one of the things that's unfortunate is that Muslims in the Middle East don't always realize that in America, Muslims are more free to practice their religion than in many countries in the Islamic world. So if Europe can be the kind of place that inspires people to follow values of democracy and freedom, then the immigrant communities, through their communications, can provide a very positive influence on what happens in the southern Mediterranean. The question about how fast democracy will proceed is a difficult one. It's very likely that some countries in the Arab world, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, will have a harder time moving toward democracy than others. Morocco, Tunisia, and I think Egypt are more likely to move in the direction of democracy because their populations are a bit older, their economies are a bit more industrialized, they have larger middle classes, and so they have some advantages. Doesn't mean that everything will work out well, but it would be foolish to expect all of the Arab countries to progress on exactly the same timetable. That's also the case for democracy across different groups. It is likely that women's rights will not advance as rapidly in the Arab world as they do in some parts of Europe. On the other hand, Switzerland did not give women the right to vote until 1971. So Europeans can't say that we've always given all rights to everyone from the beginning. Different countries pursue this at different rates. If people are given a free choice in the Arab world to choose their own destiny, many of them, of course, will choose a great commitment to Islamic values. That's their history and their culture. You can't expect otherwise. But they want that to be a choice, and they want their governments to be responsive to them. And that means having democratic institutions. So I expect we'll see the growth of democracy in politics, the gradual spread of human rights, in some countries, faster liberation of women, as in Tunisia. Other countries will lag in that regard. I think the rights of Christians and Jews will be an issue, but I'm at least fairly optimistic that the Middle East has been a world where, for most of history, different faiths have worked together. So I hope that will come about again. Knowledge is universal, and science is universal. But progress in science requires an infrastructure. You need some generations to build up university teaching, technically skilled workers, research labs, and standards of the highest scientific work. So there's no immediate danger that the West is going to lose its leading role. It will take a generation for even China and India to catch up fully to the West, and probably 2 generations for the Arab world to catch up in regard to being on the leading edge of science and innovation. On the other hand, if you say, will the West always keep its edge for hundreds of years in the future? I think that would be rash. The broad scope of history shows that for many years, India and China, and for many centuries, the Islamic world, were in the vanguard of scientific progress. Europe gained its leadership in part by building on the accomplishments of Indian and Islamic scientists. So it would only be reasonable to expect that at some point in history, all the peoples of the world would contribute in a more balanced way to scientific progress. That doesn't hurt us. I mean, Westerners don't suffer if other countries develop patents for great medicines or useful products. It does mean that some of our pride, maybe even a little of our arrogance about being the better civilization, will have to give way to realities that have historically always been different and will be different again. Well, for one thing, the United States will need some new allies. The old architecture of the world, with a democratic first world and a communist second world and then a poor, underdeveloped third world, is now practically ancient history. We're moving toward a situation where we have a developed world that increasingly includes large regions of China, India, parts of the Gulf, and so on, and a developing world that is still poor but growing rapidly in terms of size and economic strength. At the same time, that first world is aging and has fiscal responsibilities toward its aging population that will limit the growth of its own military spending. So if there's going to be a new defense posture, it's not going to look like the United States carrying the world on its military shoulders. Instead, it will look like the United States, I'll repeat Obama's words, leading from behind or perhaps from a more supporting position. I think the role of the United States will be to try to build diverse alliances and coalitions to respond to specific problems. Libya was one such. Bosnia was another. I expect many of the future problems will lay further outside of Europe, perhaps in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia. But these are going to be efforts that will involve some of the younger countries that have larger populations and fast-growing economies in teamwork with countries of Europe, the United States. That's simply demographically necessary because Europe and the United States won't be able to put boots on the ground where that's necessary to prevent humanitarian disasters or to respond to the breakdown of law and order. So more regional coalitions, more specific coalitions, but I hope also more diverse and balanced coalitions of emerging powers along with the older powers as a way to deal with problems of the future. One of Europe's big challenges is deciding what Europe will be in the future and how Europe will present itself to the world. And I think the path toward greater strength in Europe is going to be preserving the cultural differences among European countries, but reducing the political and economic differences among them. And that will require the broader European democracy, but also greater harmonization of laws and regulations, and a greater willingness to allow the free movement, not only of people and goods, but also of the best practices in industry, environment. The more Europe becomes a whole politically and economically, the stronger Europe is. The challenge is to manage to do that while retaining the cultural richness and not giving in to the urge for conflict and national self-identity.